If you don't sign, then from now on, in this house, it's as if you never existed. In that moment, a question surfaced in my mind, not loud but persistent. Was I afraid of losing my family, or afraid of the first time not being loved anymore? I just sat there, back straight, hands resting on my knees, like a child who had learned very well how not to make anyone uncomfortable. If you've ever sat in a warm room among familiar people, yet still felt like you no longer had a place, maybe this story will reach you. Maybe it will help you get through a long night when you wonder whether you're existing in the right way or not. Before I continue my story, I want to ask you something very simple. Where are you listening to this story right now? In the living room, in your bedroom, or in a moving car? If this touches any part of you, or if you think it should be shared with someone who needs it, gently press like, leave a few comments to let me know where you are, and stay until the end. Some stories don't promise quick answers, but they can offer a little reassurance. This video's content was supported by AI and edited by humans with the intention of offering reflection and educational value. It does not encourage anyone to follow these actions. It only hopes to accompany you in this moment. At that time, I didn't know. That piece of paper wasn't just about property. It was about erasing me from a story I had lived in my entire life. That dinner, from the outside, had nothing remarkable about it. My mother made her familiar roasted chicken, the kind she cooked on weekend evenings when she wanted everything to look settled. The smell of butter and thyme drifted softly through the kitchen. The television was on low in the corner, the local news scrolling through weather and traffic numbers. We talked about very ordinary things. A new neighbor who had just moved in, gas prices creeping up again, the maple tree in front of the house losing its leaves early this year. I stood up several times during the meal. I picked more chicken for my mother, poured hot tea, grabbed extra napkins. When a few drops of sauce splashed onto the table, I reached over and wiped them immediately, out of long-trained reflex. No one asked me to, but I did it as if it were my natural place in this room. No one looked at me for more than a second, and I didn't expect them to. My mother talked about plans to renovate the living room. She spoke with enthusiasm, turned to me, and smiled. "Emily is always so easygoing," she said lightly, like an offhand compliment, then turned back to continue the conversation with someone else. No one reacted. No one stopped eating. But that sentence, for some reason, didn't pass like the others. I was still standing there, holding the teapot, thin steam rising, and for the first time in many years, I slowed down enough to hear what those two words really meant. Easygoing. It meant not arguing, not asking, not making anyone uncomfortable. It meant sitting in the right place, speaking at the right time, and staying silent when needed. I suddenly realized I had spent my entire adulthood training myself in that quality, as if it were something to be proud of. I used to believe I did that out of love, because I didn't want to create tension, because I thought family needed calm more than difficult questions. But when I sat down and looked around the table, I noticed something else. No one asked what I thought about the renovation. No one asked what plans I had for the coming months. Decisions were stated, agreed upon, finalized, as if I were only there to fill a seat. There was a very familiar feeling, one I knew I wasn't alone in having felt. The feeling of being loved, but not listened to. Of being kept, but not counted. It didn't sting sharply. It lingered. Like a faint hum you grow so used to that you stop noticing it. Dinner ended. I gathered the plates, stacked them neatly, and carried them into the kitchen. The soft clink of porcelain sounded steady and even. I turned on the sink and watched the water run over my hands. Behind me, everyone kept talking, their voices blending into a familiar background noise. No one mentioned what my mother had said. No one thought there was anything more to say. I wiped the table one last time as carefully as always, as if nothing had happened. Standing by the sink, I suddenly remembered the times before. Not as a rush of memories, but like thin sheets of paper sliding over one another in my mind, the times I had signed. Quietly, without drama, just afternoons at the dining table or in my mother's office, the pen already placed, the paper folded neatly. The first time was a small agreement related to the family's old house. My mother said that if I signed, things would be less complicated. I signed because, at that time, I believed complications were something to avoid at all costs. Another time was a power of attorney for a financial decision I didn't fully understand. My mother said she was tired and didn't want to explain everything at length. I signed because I didn't want her to feel upset. And then there were times I signed for no clear reason at all, except the feeling that if I didn't, the atmosphere in the house would change. Each time I told myself I was sacrificing a little to preserve something bigger, I called it maturity, being considerate of others. And I believed that for a very long time, until I began to notice a small detail, repeated too often to ignore. After every signature, I spoke less in the conversations that followed, not because I lacked opinions, but because they seemed unnecessary. Subsequent decisions were made faster, more efficiently, without anyone needing to look in my direction. I was still there, still sitting in the right place, but my role faded, like pencil marks erased over and over. There was one family meeting I remember clearly. I sat there listening as everyone discussed things, and suddenly I noticed my signature on a stack of papers in the middle of the table. It was clear, bold, very present. But throughout nearly an hour of conversation, no one mentioned my name. No one asked what I thought. The signature was there, but I wasn't. That moment, for some reason, made it impossible for me to keep pretending everything was fine. I began to understand something uncomfortable. I thought I was sacrificing, but I was actually erasing myself. No one took my voice away. I had set it down little by little with every stroke of the pen. I wasn't forced. No hand pressed down on mine. I chose to sign every time, each choice wrapped in a very nice, very reasonable explanation. Realizing that didn't make me angry. It didn't make me ashamed. It just made me quieter in a different way. For the first time, I didn't rush to blame anyone. I looked back at myself the way you look at someone you know who's been walking the same road for too long without stopping to ask where it leads. I stood in that kitchen, the water still running steadily, and understood that tonight wasn't just about an unsigned piece of paper. It was the endpoint of many times I had signed before, without knowing that every signature left behind an empty space. After that night, no one in the house mentioned the paper again. My mother brewed coffee as she did every morning, placed the cup in its usual spot. She asked if I'd slept well, if I wanted more toast, her voice even and unchanged. If you didn't know what had happened, you'd think we'd just had a peaceful evening. That calmness was what made the air tense in a very strange way, like a string pulled just tight enough that no one could see it, but tight enough that no one could breathe deeply. My mother treated me as if that conversation had never happened. Not cold, not warmer either, just proper. So proper that every gap was covered by routine. I helped her clean the kitchen. She thanked me. I said good morning. She nodded. We passed each other in the narrow hallway like two people who had agreed not to collide. The next evening, as I was folding a thin blanket on the sofa, my mother stood in the doorway and asked softly, as if afraid of disturbing me, "Could you sleep in your old room for convenience?" The question came with a polite smile and that familiar tilt of her head. The old room, the one I had left years ago, where everything had been preserved like a small museum of the past. I nodded out of reflex. In that moment, I didn't feel pushed away. I just felt rearranged. There are families that don't send you away. They just rearrange things so you quietly disappear. That sentence echoed in my head as I rolled my suitcase into the old room, the wheels humming across the wooden floor. I understood something slowly but clearly. My silence was being interpreted as consent. No signature needed, no verbal agreement. As long as I didn't say anything more, everything would continue in the most convenient way for everyone else. I sat down on the edge of the bed, touched the freshly washed sheets, the familiar detergent scent pulling up distant memories. And I remembered the first time I learned how to be good. I was a child, standing in the kitchen, listening to adults talk. I learned that if I didn't interrupt, people would smile at me. If I waited to be called on, the room would feel more comfortable. I carried that lesson into adulthood, believing it was the safest way to love. But sitting in that old room, I asked myself a question I had always avoided. If I kept staying silent, what would disappear next. Not immediately, not loudly, just small pieces vanishing neatly until I could no longer recognize my own shape in this house. That night, I put on a jacket and stepped outside without telling anyone. Not to leave, not to prove anything. I just needed to walk. The street in front of the house was quiet, streetlights casting long streaks of light onto the damp sidewalk. The air was cool and clear, enough for me to take a deep breath without feeling heavy in my chest. I walked slowly, matching my steps to my breathing, as if the city were listening to me in a way that a house never had. A rare car passed at the end of the street. One house turned on its porch light late, warm yellow glowing. The faint smell of freshly cut grass lingered. Those small, ordinary details suddenly became mirrors of what was happening inside me. I realized I wasn't rushing. I wasn't shaking. I didn't need to prepare sentences in case I ran into someone. I was just walking. And then, in a very strange moment, I realized something that made me stop. I wasn't crying anymore. No tears soaking my collar, no tightness in my throat. The feeling didn't arrive with sound, but with absence. Like when you're used to a clock ticking all night, and when the battery dies, the room suddenly feels quieter than normal. I stood there listening to that quiet and understood that the anger had passed faster than I'd expected. I had thought I'd be angry for a long time, that I would replay the conversation in my head, adding and removing words, wondering what I should have said. But no. What remained wasn't anger. It was something else, clarity. A clean, steady awareness that didn't need explanation. I began to see things as they were, without exaggeration, without softening. I didn't want revenge. The thought came and went, light as a gust of wind. Revenge would only keep me in the same room, just in a different position. What I wanted was to live differently. Not better than anyone else. Just differently from the old way that had slowly erased me. I wanted to wake up without having to check how quiet I needed to be that day. When I returned, my phone lit up. A missed call from my mother. Just one. Before, I would have called back immediately. I would have apologized without even knowing what I was apologizing for. I would have smoothed things over, put everything back where it was. This time, I placed the phone face down on the table. I didn't dial. I didn't text. Not out of anger, but because I needed to hear myself before listening to anyone else. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the old room silent around me. And for the first time, that silence was no longer something I used to please others. It became a space where I could stand still, see clearly, and not rush back into a familiar role. The next morning, I woke up very early. The dim light of dawn slipped through the curtains, landing as a thin strip across the floor. The old room was still as quiet as it had been the night before. The familiar smell of wood, the soft ticking from the heating pipes. I sat up, barely reaching for my glass of water when my phone vibrated on the nightstand. My mother's name appeared. Neat, simple, with no other icon beside it. I picked it up and stared for a long time. Not the kind of stare where you make a quick decision, the kind where you're trying to hear what's speaking inside you. The bright screen reflected my face, not tense, not rushed. Just a small, empty space between breaths. The phone vibrated again and again. The familiar steady buzz, like a gentle knock at the door that wouldn't give up. I didn't answer. I didn't decline either. I let it ring until it went silent. That moment lasted only a few dozen seconds, but it felt like I'd just stepped over a thin boundary I'd never dared to touch before. I didn't do it out of anger. The anger had passed the night before, settling somewhere on the damp sidewalk. I did it because, for the first time, I needed to hear myself first. Not to prepare a response, not to smooth things over, just to know where I stood when no one was on the other end of the line. I set the phone down, my palm still warm, and a familiar memory surfaced naturally. I remembered other mornings when I was the one who called back first, even when I was busy, even when I wasn't ready. I remembered standing outside a door, making a quick call just to say, "I'm sorry," more out of habit than thought. I learned to do that very early, that a family's peace is often held together because someone has to speak first. The guilt came right after, uninvited. It wasn't intense, just warm, like a familiar coat. I wondered if my mother was sitting at the dining table, her coffee cup by her right hand, waiting for the phone to ring. I wondered if I was being selfish. Those questions weren't new. They'd lived with me long enough to know how to find me, but this time I didn't let them pull me away. I stood up, opened the curtains, and let more light spill in. I took a deep breath and listened to the morning birds outside. The guilt was still there, real, and I let it stay there, without rushing to sweep it away. My phone lay still on the nightstand, the screen dark. No message came right after, no second call. That silence was different from every silence before. Not a gap I was expected to fill, but a pause waiting for someone else's reaction. At the time, I didn't know this decision would change the way my mother looked at me. We met 2 days later, late in the afternoon. I went back to the house with nothing but a small bag. The sky was overcast, the clouds hanging low. My mother opened the door and stepped slightly to the side so I could walk in. The gesture was polite, just like always, but something had shifted. Not coldness, distance measured carefully, the way you check the temperature before touching something fragile. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table. The tea in front of my mother sent up a faint thread of steam. She wrapped both hands around the cup but didn't drink. I noticed she avoided holding my gaze for more than a few seconds at a time. When she finally spoke, her tone was still even, but the words dropped clearly between us. "You've changed." I didn't react right away. That sentence used to make me panic. I used to rush to explain that I was still the same, that I didn't mean to make things harder. But this time, I heard it differently, not as an accusation, but as an observation mixed with worry. And then slowly, a thought formed. My mother wasn't angry. She was scared. Scared because she couldn't predict me anymore. Scared because my usual reflexes, apologizing, calling back, giving in, hadn't shown up. Scared because when I stood still, the old order didn't run on its own anymore. Realizing that softened something in me, not because everything was better, but because I could finally see the real shape of the tension between us. When my mother asked what I planned to do next, I said very simply, "I need time." I spoke slowly, slow enough to hear myself. In that moment, I caught her eyes. They weren't sharp, they weren't angry. They opened for a second, then closed again, like a door caught by the wind. And I understood. Boundaries, when they're first set, always throw other people off balance first. I didn't argue. I didn't give a long explanation. There was no speech about autonomy or pain. I just sat there, back straight, both hands resting on the table. The trembling was real, but it didn't push me backward. I let the quiet sit between us without filling it with my old, familiar words. My mother looked down at the tea and then moved it aside. She nodded, very slightly, as if accepting new information she didn't yet know where to place. We ended the meeting without hugging. No one won, no one lost. Only one truth came into the open. My mother wasn't used to having a child with boundaries, and I was learning how to stand inside those boundaries without turning them into a wall. When I stood up to leave, the sky outside the porch looked a little darker. I opened the door, turned back, and said goodbye. My mother replied, her voice still polite. And in the very first step away from the house, I knew what had just happened wasn't a split. It was an adjustment. Slow, difficult, but necessary, so the two of us could see each other with something more real. I moved out on a cloudy morning. No long goodbye, no final instructions. I packed my things into cardboard boxes, the essentials first, the rest later. When I pulled my suitcase over the threshold, I paused for a beat, as if checking that I hadn't forgotten something important. Then I left. The door closed behind me so softly I didn't even hear the lock. The new apartment was smaller than I'd imagined. One bedroom, a narrow kitchen, and a window facing a parking lot. No familiar scent, no wall clock ticking. Just enough quiet for me to hear the sound of my keys landing on the table. I opened the window to let the air in, and soft gray light spread across the empty wooden floor. The feeling wasn't relief, and it wasn't heaviness either. It was neutral, like a blank page waiting to be written. On the first evening, I cooked for one. Simple noodles, water coming to a gentle boil, steam fogging the glass. I set the plate on the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. No one asked for more. No one commented. I ate slowly and realized I could taste everything more clearly. That moment made me stop mid-bite, not because I was sad, but because of something else. Dinner alone wasn't empty at all. It was full of presence. I was there, whole, without having to reshape myself to match someone else's rhythm. Some choices don't make you stronger right away, but they make you more real. That thought echoed in me as I washed the dishes, listening to the steady sound of running water. I began rewriting my habits, not with long lists, but with small things. I brewed coffee the way I liked it, without guessing whether someone else could drink it. I woke up a little earlier to walk around the neighborhood, learning how to say good morning to myself. I put my phone farther from the bed so I wouldn't reach for familiar reassurance at night. It wasn't loneliness, it was the first time I wasn't performing. I didn't have to say I'm fine when I wasn't sure. I didn't have to smile to keep the air calm. Those movements, small, quiet, slowly formed a different rhythm of living. Not loud, but clear. I began to see the difference between silence and emptiness, between being alone and being left behind. Some evenings, I sat on the floor with my back against a sofa I hadn't bought yet, watching the lights in the parking lot dim one by one. I didn't rush to call anyone, not because I was afraid of bothering them, but because I didn't need to. The guilt visited sometimes, but it no longer held power. I let it come and go, like clouds passing the window. Awareness ripened slowly. I understood that what I was learning wasn't independence in a hard, rigid way. It was the ability to stay inside my own life without needing permission. And when I stood in that small apartment listening to the night fall evenly, I knew I was laying a foundation for a different way of living, imperfect, but real. One afternoon, when I had just gotten back to the apartment, a thin envelope lay outside my door. No rushed stamp, no note. My mother's handwriting sat in the top left corner, so familiar I recognized it even from a distance. I carried it inside, set it on the kitchen table, washed my hands, and only then sat down. I left the envelope there for a few minutes, as if it needed time to fully exist before it could be opened. Inside was that old paper. No message attached, no request, no deadline, just the paper folded carefully, like something being returned to its original place. I spread it out on the table and read every line again. The language was still neat and neutral, without emotion. This time, as I read, my heartbeat didn't change. No familiar rush of heat, no feeling that I had to do something immediately. I folded the paper back up, the crease lining up perfectly like before. Then I pulled open the kitchen drawer, the one where I kept things I didn't know where to put yet. Old bills, an empty notebook, a few pens. I placed the paper in there between two notebooks and slid the drawer shut. I didn't sign. I didn't send it back. The whole moment happened so quickly that I had to stand still for a second just to realize what I'd done. I didn't need to prove anything. That thought arrived softly, more like confirmation than decision. I didn't need to prove I was right, that I'd been hurt, or that someone else had been wrong. I didn't need to prove I'd grown up, either. Those needs, I realized, had slowly fallen away in the days of living alone, between new habits and quiet evenings. Worth doesn't come from a signature. It doesn't live in whether I agree or refuse on paper. It lives in the fact that I can set something down without being afraid of losing myself. Realizing that, I felt my shoulders lighten a little, like taking off a coat I no longer needed. That night I cooked, as usual. The kitchen light reflected off the clean counter. When I opened the drawer for a knife, I saw the corner of the envelope peeking out between the notebooks. It was there, quiet, not demanding, not urgent. I closed the drawer and kept cooking, as if everything had finally been put in the right place. When I sat down to eat, I thought about the question that had been hanging there since the day I left. Would I ever go back? The question didn't make me restless anymore. It was still there, open, not needing an answer right now. I understood that some questions can only be answered by continuing to live, not by a sudden decision. And in that small kitchen, With warm food smells in the air, I allowed that question to rest, unfinished but no longer heavy. I still see my mother. We meet for coffee on quiet afternoons, sitting at a table near the window where the light is soft and no one has to speak loudly to be heard. Nothing is the same as before, and I don't try to force it back. I speak less but more clearly. When I need to answer, I answer simply. When I need silence, I let silence stay there, without rushing to fill it. I no longer explain why I need time, and I don't ask permission for my choices. Sometimes my mother asks what I'm thinking. I smile and say, I'm okay. That's all. Nothing more. I don't need to be completely understood. I've learned that some distance isn't punishment, it's air. And when I allow myself air, our meetings become lighter, more real. We don't avoid each other, and we don't force each other to be who we used to be. I'm learning how to love without erasing myself. That didn't come from one big decision, but from small habits. Choosing a time to call that works for me, ending a conversation when I'm tired, not saying sure when I'm not ready. I realize love doesn't have to be proven through constant yielding. It can exist with boundaries, and boundaries don't make love disappear. They just make love less blurry. I didn't win. No one lost. What I gained was adulthood, an adulthood that doesn't need an audience. I understand now that growing up sometimes means accepting a new version of yourself, even when other people haven't had time to get used to it yet. I stayed, but not in the old role. I stayed with myself. And for me, that is enough. The story you just heard is fictional, inspired by real-life situations and very human experiences. The content was supported by AI and edited by humans with the intention of offering reflection and emotional value, not encouraging anyone to follow these actions. The value of this story isn't about who is right or wrong, but about each person learning not to abandon themselves in the most familiar relationships. If there's a small gift for you after tonight, maybe it's this. You're allowed to grow up, even when others aren't ready to keep pace. Before I go, I want to ask you something very simple. Where are you listening to this story right now? In a quiet kitchen, on a familiar bed, or in a car parked by the side of the road late at night? Wherever you are, thank you for staying until the very end. If this story touched any part of you, or if you think it could help someone get through a long night, gently press like and share it. If you want to keep accompanying slow, thoughtful family stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Your presence, even if it's only one view, still means something. Thank you so much for listening.